Andrew, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Danica Di Giorgio, filling in for Sharri. But first this evening, to the dangerous crusade to censure what you see online. There's a growing push to tell us what to think, how to think, and what we should or should not see. Labor is using a tragic week in Sydney to push a misinformation agenda through knee-jerk legislation.
Overwhelmingly, Australians want misinformation and disinformation to stop. This isn't about freedom of expression. This is about the dangerous implications that can occur when things that are simply not true, that everyone knows is not true, are replicated and weaponised in order to cause division.
This isn't about freedom of expression, he says, yet who is to decide what is fake news or not? Well, it seems Albanese has picked a fight with ex-owner Elon Musk. The billionaire has openly defied orders to take down social media posts relating to the Bondi massacre and alleged terror attack. The Australian censorship commissar is demanding global content bans, according to Elon Musk. While Australia's digital watchdog cannot force X to take down the content, much to its dismay. The Safety Commissioner does not have the authority to dictate what content X's users can see globally. We will robustly challenge this unlawful and dangerous approach in court. Now, there is no doubt after the Bondi massacre and alleged terrorist attack that the internet was certainly awash with speculation. And, of course, we want good information online. But the question is, does it warrant government intervention to stop you from accessing information or from making an informed decision about what you are seeing? Now, I was a news reporter for 11 years and I was always taught about the importance of showing viewers, readers or listeners exactly what was going on and from all points of view, not to hide perspectives, but to show the reality as it is. So to hide videos or images, it just doesn't sit well. And the freedom of expression the PM talks about has been shattered overseas as the consequences of censorship play out across the world. Canada's plan to regulate online content has been labelled Orwellian. It would lead to overbroad violations of expressive freedom, privacy, protest rights and liberty, and would give a new regulatory agency the power to be judge, jury and executioner. Look out, Australia. Scotland's new hate speech laws have people like J.K. Rowling screaming, "Come over and arrest me," over online trans comments. And let's take a look at Brazil. A standoff between Elon Musk has escalated. A Supreme Court judge opened an inquiry into the billionaire after Musk said he would reactivate accounts on the social media platform X that the judge had ordered blocked. And here's the thing. There's been no disclosure over which social media accounts were ordered blocked or why. Just as it's playing out overseas, it's clear there is appetite from the government to bring it here.
People are filthy at Elon Musk and you can see the kind of rubbish that gets peddled on his business. You know, the very least he could do would be to comply with our laws.
Social media has a responsibility. By and large, people responded appropriately to the calls by the Safety Commissioner. X chose not to.
Well, hang on a sec. Let's see what the Safety Commissioner actually said.
So if they fail to remove the content, then we can go to the search engines such as Google or Bing to really minimize the amount of content the Australians can see.
An open admission to minimise the amount of content Australians can see. How does that sit with you? And here was the New South Wales Police Commissioner.
There is misinformation being communicated across social media and people should not share any of that information. The source of information should be from police and law enforcement authorities, and if people have concerns, they should check our websites, our socials.
The only source of information, she says. Well, what about the information we were fed during the pandemic, which turned out to be a lie? As our own Chris Kenny found out exclusively, many of the 4,000 social media posts secretly censored by government during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic contained factual information and reasonable arguments, rather than misinformation. Digital posts released after Freedom of Information applications show the censored information shared facts such as the ineffectiveness of vaccines in preventing COVID-19 infection and transmission, or argued against measures such as mask mandates and lockdowns. Yet here we are being told to only believe one source of information. Extraordinary. So if we are forced to censure vision from the Sydney attacks, then what does that mean for other horrific moments in our history? September 11, the Bali bombings. What about the vision of JFK's assassination? Would that be deemed appropriate to view online now? What happened to the free and open society we live in? This is not communist China. And yet opposition leader Peter Dutton has thrown his support behind tougher laws.
No question at all, and I think there's a bipartisan position in relation to this. We know that the companies, and we've seen some of the comments from Elon Musk overnight, they see themselves above the law, and the Australian law here should apply equally in the real world as it does online.
How can the Liberal Party even have the word Liberal in their title? Again, we do want good information online, but perhaps resources would be better spent elsewhere.
If we're really interested in pulling down things that are damaging to people, young people in particular, then why is the E-Safety Commissioner not tackling every single bit of online pornography that's on the internet at the moment? That we can show very clearly the impact that has on young people, on their relationships and on their views against women as well.
Spot on. What gives governments the right to decide what we are capable or incapable of making an informed decision about? Is that really a society we want to live in, where we ultimately become like robots, so null and void to our surroundings, unable to show any emotion or even make a judgment? It is not a bureaucrat in Canberra's job to tell us what has occurred. Let us evaluate our own truth. Also coming up tonight, the latest polls show Labor trailing on the cost of living crisis. So can the Treasurer turn things around in the May budget? And an apology to remember why Brittany Higgins' olive branch to Senator Linda Reynolds might not be enough to clean up the political mess she left behind. But first, let's bring in my panel for this evening, Sky News hosts James Morrow and Caleb Bond. Hi to you both. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Pleasure to be here.
Caleb, let's start with the government's misinformation push. I mean, surely it is not some Canberra bureaucrat's job who are sitting in their office, in their air-conditioned office, to tell us what we should be thinking and how we should think. What do you think?
Well, correct. There are two problems here. The first is that they are using two tragic events to essentially push their misinformation, disinformation agenda, which has been going on for more than a year now. And the ultimate goal of that is to control the information that media outlets and individuals and social media companies can publish online. They want to decide via ACMA, the media authority, what is and isn't the truth. Now, when the government starts becoming the arbiter of the truth, you ought to be worried, because that's what they do in communist regimes. It's not up to the government to tell you what is and isn't real. And the other problem is the idea that this vision should not be allowed to be seen or shared in any way. Because the vision is not misinformation or disinformation. No. The vision is simply what happened, whether that be from the alleged terror attack in Sydney on Monday or what happened at Bondi Junction. Now, I've always taken the view that if there's a piece of vision that within the various codes we have to adhere to, most of which are self-imposed media industry codes,
yes,
that we should show that to viewers and or readers.
Yeah.
If Facebook, Twitter or X as it now is, I tend to believe they are publishers. They should be able to make editorial decisions about what they do or do not allow on their platforms. And if they want to allow that vision, that is their decision. It's not up to the government to tell them whether they can or cannot.
I completely agree with you. It's not up to a bureaucrat. And how would they even know? Who gets to make that decision? James, we've seen this happening all around the world, as I just mentioned in my editorial there. Are you worried that Australia is now facing the same fate when it comes to censorship?
Absolutely, Danica. Look, this is a huge worry because we are seeing this happen all over the world. We're seeing this in Ireland. We're seeing this in Canada. We're seeing this in parts of Europe. We're seeing this very shockingly in Brazil, which has gone very far down this road in a really sinister way. And there have been huge demonstrations against that judge and against the government, in part because of this. This thing here, you can see exactly how the government, the Labour government, alighted on this. You know, they had a big problem. They had this big incident with the alleged terror attack on this bishop, and they suddenly said, this causes us a lot of problems because people are going to be talking about things like social cohesion, alleged Islamic radicalization, integration, multiculturalism. All things that the government doesn't want people talking about, particularly in the wake of the Israel-Hamas war and the electoral calculations that they've got going on in Western Sydney and in other suburbs of the country. So they say, oh, well, hang on. Elon Musk, he's the real villain here. And let's get everybody here talking about Musk and how they let this piece of vision out there, which, as you said, is not misinformation. This actually happened. And so, you know, let's call that misinformation. Let's say that's to blame here, not other sorts of issues which people might start talking about, and have the bonus that then once you start down this road, God knows what people can talk about. I mean, we've seen this with COVID. We've seen this in other countries with issues around transgender issues. We could see it around climate change. We could see it with all sorts of things. This is a very dangerous road to be going down, Danica.
Absolutely, and you're right. Where does it end? How long is a piece of string? I mean, this is when it starts, you don't know where it ends. Now, look, it's been a bad day for the Albanese government after two new polls showing more and more voters are deserting the party. In the Australian's latest news poll survey, Peter Dutton is shrinking the gap on the Better PM poll, increasing a point from 34 to 35%, while Anthony Albanese's remained unchanged on 48%. And even in the Sydney Morning Herald's Resolve political monitor, it found the Labor's primary vote has reduced to 30% from 32%, while support for the coalition increased from 35 to 36. Caleb, Albo seems to be really struggling to convert support for his policies into political points. How do you read it?
Well, look, I mean, the results we saw from the polls today are marginal, might we say. There's no massive movement, and things could well change in a year's time when we're probably looking at another election. I've always taken the view that there will be an election called as soon as interest rates start to come down, and it will be an election run on the platform of, you know, we've put in the hard yards, we've got inflation down, interest rates are starting to come back down again. We need your support to finish the job. You know, we've made it this far. Come on, let's see it through, which is essentially what Bob Hawke ran on for his second term in the 1980s. I still suspect that will be the case. It just depends on when exactly we get those interest rate cuts. But when you look at the polling you had before Christmas and before New Year, which actually showed the coalition edging ahead in terms of the two-party preferred, that has softened a bit, but it's not softened to the point where the Prime Minister would be or should be confident that he has an election win on the cards when he goes to an election. I don't suspect that they are staring down the barrel of a loss, but what they are very much looking at is minority government. And then you start talking about, well, do we go into power with the Greens? Do we go into power with the Teals? Oh,
goodness.
You know,
I mean, please,
we know what happened in 2010, and that did ultimately spell the end of the government after that term. But it could be interesting and dangerous.
Look, that's a fair point. As James, as Caleb said, OK, a minor change here, but how much pressure does it put Labor under, particularly ahead of the May budget?
Well, look, the May budget is not going to wind up, I think, with anything particularly huge. We've already been warned about that, not to expect any sort of huge, reforming programs or huge, big spends there. And, this is actually reflective of the fact that, well, not only budgets rarely actually move the needle very much for government one way or the other because everything's dropped out before the budget is handed down. But beyond that, though, the issue here, Caleb is correct about the sort of the electoral mass there, but beyond the fact that interest rates likely aren't going to come down as quickly as people think. If you look at what's happening in the United States, there's very little appetite, I think, on the part of the Fed and Janet Yellen, who I think wanted to get those rates down before their election in November, to do that, given inflation's stickiness there and around the world. But the other issue, too, really is that we are seeing the problem that this is not a government of big ideas. It was a government elected largely on a protest vote against the coalition and Scott Morrison. And they had one big idea, which was The Voice, which fell over. Now they're saying things like, oh, well, made in Australia. How does that sound? How does that sound to you? That sounds really good. But what does that mean? Well, it seems to mean at this point, shoveling a lot of money towards non-competitive industries to prop up renewables investors. So,
Yes.
you know, we need something bigger, I think, to see this through.
Yeah, and I feel like that's going to be the slogan as we head into another election. Or we're just going to hear about the future made in Australia. It's going to drive us all nuts. But look, in another blow to Labor, mining magnate Gina Reinhardt says the Chinese Communist Party is doing a better job than our government. In a keynote address, she said which country's government understands the importance of reliable electricity production and is building many coal-fired power stations and nuclear ones. Caleb, she's got a point here.
She does. Look, I'm sure many people in China would disagree that their government does a better job for them than ours does. But Mrs. Reinhardt has a very valid point about, you know, look, it's easy to run a government when you're a communist regime because you don't have an opposition and you don't have to deal with the day-to-day politics in that sense. But China is a country very much like India that acknowledges that it has a large poor population and the only way to maintain the confidence of those people is to pull those people out of poverty. And the best way to pull those people out of poverty is with industry, and the only way to have industry is with cheap power. China, India, etc., and much of the third world doesn't give a rip about whether or not they're putting emissions out into the atmosphere.
Correct.
What they care about is making sure that they have an economy that is turning over and is producing stuff for their people. Meanwhile, we here in Australia and the rest of the West, you know, we would much rather self-flagellate and actually do ourselves in while the rest of the world is powering ahead and we go, look at us, we're 1% of the world's emissions and we're going to cut ourselves off at the knees and have nothing, except we're now going to build wind turbines or something.
Well,
Made in Australia. Which no one's going to buy because they're too bloody expensive because they're made in Australia. And the ones that are made in China with our coal are the ones that we'll be buying. Make it make sense.
I think you've just put that absolutely perfectly, Caleb Bond. James, do you think that Gina Reinhardt has a point here?
Yeah, look, I think Gina Reinhardt has a very big point here. The fact of the matter is that we are an energy-rich nation. We should have reliable and cheap energy, abundant energy, to drive our industries, and yet we don't. And we see this in our power bills, and we see this in what's going to happen with the renewables transition. And, you know, what I'm concerned about, just to bounce off of what Gina Reinhardt said about China versus Australia, you know, my concern is if you look at other countries like Germany, which have essentially deindustrialized and you know, have huge energy problems and where their economy is going. And then you look at China and the state of their social control. I'm worried that, guys, we're going to wind up in Australia with the worst of both worlds. We're going to wind up with Chinese social media control and a German economy.
I think you've absolutely... Look, the both of you have said it perfectly tonight. James Morrow, Caleb Bond, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Well, stay with us. Coming up after the break, is Brittany Higgins' apology enough to clean up the political mess she left behind? Legal Eagle Sam Macedoni will join me next. Plus, why one expert says record immigration could be behind Labor's budget woes. Welcome back. Well, Brittany Higgins has broken her silence for the first time since the Bruce Lehrmann defamation ruling. In an online statement over the weekend, she said, while I do not agree with all of Justice Lee's findings, I do respect his observations about the many people scarred and damaged in the aftermath of my rape. Higgins goes on to say Senator Reynolds and Fiona Brown have also been hurt, and for that I am also sorry. My perceptions and feelings about what happened in the days and weeks after my rape are different from theirs. I deeply regret we have not yet found common ground. But it seems her public apology isn't enough to stop the defamation trial from going ahead, with Senator Linda Reynolds noting, at enormous emotional and financial cost, I have fought for 3 years to expose the truth in relation to my conduct. For more on this, I'm now joined by Macedoni Legal's Sam Macedoni. Sam, lovely to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
What did you make of Brittany Higgins' statement over the weekend?
Look, it was too little but not enough. She said, I'm sorry for the scars and the hurt that I've caused, but your perception of what happened and my perception of what happened are not the same. And Linda Reynolds has said, well, until you accept what Justice Lee has said, that there was no cover-up, that we did not go against you and try to indicate that you weren't raped, that it's no deal. I'm going to proceed with my defamation action.
I mean, Justice Lee basically debunked that when he handed out his findings on Monday, that there actually was no political cover-up from the very beginning.
None at all. And it seems that Higgins doesn't accept that. Mind you, Linda Reynolds has also said that at this stage the only olive branch that's been handed out is by Brittany Higgins, but not by Shiraz, her boyfriend. So it's still well and truly up in the air, and I think that come July we're going to look at another case.
Well, this is it, because as Linda Reynolds said in her statement, it's not enough for her to abandon her defamation case against Brittany Higgins and David Shiraz. Why do you think she still wants to proceed here?
She wants to clear her name. I mean, it's out there, and there were a lot of social media posts about the fact that she was instrumental in covering up what happened, together with her Chief of Staff, Fiona Brown, and she says that was just not true, and she wants the truth to come out. She was not involved in any cover-up whatsoever. And until such time as the other party, Higgins and Shiraz, accept that, this defamation action will proceed.
And when you think about it, from the very beginning, she wasn't really given an opportunity to give her side of the story, and that seems to be what she wants to do based on that statement that she released.
Well, exactly right. But as she said, I mean, neither party are bound by what Justice Lee has said. However, she's quite prepared to go to court to prove once again that there was no cover-up.
Well, she's got nothing to lose.
Absolutely nothing, and I think she's really got the facts and circumstances behind her.
Yeah, absolutely. We just spoke about how the political cover-up theory was thrown out the window by Justice Lee. I've got to ask you, Sam, I mean, given this saga has really destroyed or uprooted so many people's lives over the years, the casualty list is actually impossible to count, and it just grows and grows by every time this is brought up. But I wonder, do you think any of the key players have ever had regrets over the time?
I think personally everyone regrets the fact that this ever started in the first place. But however, Brittany Higgins was right to claim what she claimed, according to Justice Lee, on the balance of probabilities, that is. She was raped, so she was entitled to do something about it. She didn't exactly tell the truth in a lot of things during that case, but everyone copped a bit of a lashing from Justice Lee in that matter. So I think they all regret the fact that they somehow got involved, because when you come to think of it, there's just been so much happening from so many people and so many organisations. They've all been scarred.
All been scarred, and it just keeps going. It's a spiral, and it just keeps going and going, Sam.
It won't end. It
won't end. It's extraordinary. Yeah. Now, there have been a lot of calls for the Corruption Commission to examine the $2.4 million payout, which was given by the Albanese government to Brittany Higgins.
Yes.
Is it likely, do you think, that it could go to the NAC?
I don't think it will, because the claim was a workers' compensation claim for injuries and damages as a result of what occurred and how she was treated. But I really don't think that I hope it isn't part of some other further inquiry, because we've had enough offshoots, really.
Well, we certainly have.
And we don't really need any more, because if we go into that, then that's going to open up a lot of other floodgates.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that there would be a case where Brittany Higgins is actually forced to pay back that compensation?
Look, it's very difficult to get someone to pay back compensation that's been awarded in the first place. The government relied on senior counsel's advice on many levels, and they felt that it was justified, so they paid it. So I really can't see how they can claw it back. The interesting thing is whether Higgins will lose part or most of it in any defamation proceedings by Linda Reynolds that are successful.
OK, well, that's heading for another trial, so that'll be interesting. I just want to quickly ask you about Bruce Lehrmann. He's been laying low the last week since Justice Michael Lee found that on the balance of probabilities, he did rape Brittany Higgins at Parliament House. What happens next for him?
I don't think a lot's going to happen for him at all. He's going to have to lie low and let this whole thing wash over, but it's going to be some time before he gets any sort of credibility back, because at this stage he was lambasted left, right and centre by the judge. So who's going to give him a job?
Yeah.
Where's he going to get a job?
Precisely. Another fascinating week in this saga. Sam Macedonia, always good to get your updates. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Well, let's move on now to the rest of the news here. We heard today from the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, who said that the upcoming federal budget may actually downgrade forecasts for economic growth, and he's blamed international uncertainty.
We know that it's not mission accomplished because people are still hurting. You can expect to see in the budget a focus on cost of living help. A tax cut for every taxpayer will be the centrepiece of the cost of living help in the budget, and if we can afford to do a little more than that, then those decisions will be taken in the next week or two.
For more, let's bring in macro business chief economist Leith Van Onselen. Leith, thank you so much for joining us. What does this mean for any sort of cost of living relief measures in the upcoming budget?
Well, Jim Chalmers has already confirmed that cost of living relief will be included in next week's budget. He's also said that this relief is going to take the edge off inflation rather than add to inflation. So this, to me, sounds like we're going to see a further extension of Commonwealth rent assistance as well as energy subsidies. And to be quite frank, Danica, the federal government's created the rental crisis through its massive immigration policy. It's also contributed to the energy crisis by completely messing up energy policy. So I think the least it can do is provide us with some subsidies to cover the pain.
Well, you'd hope so. And I do want to get to immigration with you because there has been yet another record month for that. But just on this forecast, what does this mean for the economy more broadly?
Yeah, so it provided these subsidies are calibrated correctly to target areas of, clear inflationary pressure. So like in the rental market and energy prices, they can actually take some steam out of the CPI inflation, and actually help the RBA do its job in getting inflation under control. So they can actually be positive, provided they're calibrated correctly and they don't just give money to people to pump up inflation.
Yeah, despite this, though, the Treasurer said today that he's still hopeful of a budget surplus. Do you see Australia getting to that point still?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the federal government's undoubtedly going to deliver a budget surplus this year. The reason for that is the surplus has been driven from three booms. So we've had record immigration, which has increased the number of workers, record bracket creep, because taxes have all gone up, and also record high commodity prices. The big question is what will happen going forward. We're likely to see commodity prices fall, which will reduce company taxes. We're also likely to see a rise in unemployment. That's actually already forecast, as well as lower levels of immigration. So that'll take the sting out of the federal budget going forward.
All right, well, let's talk about immigration now. This is the big one. A key reason the budget is on the verge of surplus is because of record migration, with more workers paying income tax, and, of course, not to mention that record rise in bracket creep. We hear all the time, Leith, that record migration is like a Ponzi scheme. Is this just another example of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the federal government's the major beneficiary of Australia's immigration program because it collects 80% of the nation's taxes, whilst the costs are basically pushed onto, the states and onto you and me. So the federal government's been the main beneficiary of this massive 550,000 migrant increase last year, and that's because it's basically juiced personal income taxes and company taxes. The flip side of that is the poor old state governments have been left with the costs providing services and infrastructure to the ballooning population. And that's why our state governments are actually drowning in debt and they're facing credit rating downgrades. So if I was the states, I'd be screaming blue murder about this, Danica, and I'd be demanding money from the federal government so that they provide money for every new resident that lands in their jurisdiction, to provide money for infrastructure, etc. And I guarantee you, if the federal government was required to pay the states, say, $50,000 per new resident, the federal government would cut immigration quick smart, because it'd have to balance the benefits with the costs. Because at the moment, Danica, all the federal government sees with immigration is dollar signs.
Absolutely, and this is a problem. You mentioned infrastructure. The amount of arrivals are completely outpacing construction. So the state governments have got that on their hands because houses are not being built, and that's a whole other issue. But without immigration, Leith, would you say that we would actually be in a recession right now?
Oh, 100% we've been in a recession. We're actually already in a per capita recession. So the nation's growth actually fell by 1% last year in per capita terms. And all that tells you is the economy is not growing fast enough, as fast as the population. So we're going backwards per head. It's the same for housing. We're not building housing to keep up with immigration. We're not building infrastructure to keep up. We don't have the business investment to keep up with immigration, so our productivity is going backwards. Basically, we've got what I call a rat wheel economy. We're spinning around in circles, but we're not going anywhere. In fact, we're going backwards.
Yeah, we are, and yet Labor has promised that they would actually bring down the rate of immigration. But if you look at the latest figures that were released just last week, a 20% increase in February compared to January. It was an increase of an extra 100,000 people, which is absolutely extraordinary. When are we going to be feeling the impacts of the constant rise in the migration rate?
Well, we actually already are. I mean, you just have to look at the rental market. The rental vacancy rate's at a record low of just 1%. Obviously, rents are going through the roof. We're seeing people being thrown into homelessness, having to live in group housing, etc. So that is the most visible impact of it. The other impacts you're seeing if you live in Melbourne or Sydney, for example, you're seeing increased traffic congestion. Everywhere you go now takes longer. Basically, your standard of living is being slowly strangled by this high immigration. So it really does need to come down. It's growing faster than the economy can cope, faster than housing, faster than infrastructure, and faster than business investment.
Yeah, Big Australia is getting even bigger. Leith Van Onselen, great to speak with you as always. Thanks for joining us. Well, coming up, artificial not-so-intelligence declares Australia's top prime ministers. You won't believe the results. Plus, job-sharing MPs make their tilt for politics. Lots to unpack with my panel, Jo Hildebrand and Liz Storer next. Well, Meta's new artificial intelligence tool has ranked Australia's top 5 prime ministers, and, well, the results are quite concerning. Anthony Albanese was ranked the 5th best prime minister in Australian history.
Should have been number 1.
Only to be beaten by Malcolm Turnbull. Joe's ready. And Julia Gillard taking out top spot was Gough Whitlam, followed by Bob Hawke. Meta's AI tool also described Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison as controversial, naming opposition leader Peter Dutton as being among the least humane politicians. For more, they're fired up, they're ready. Sky News contributor Jo Hildebrand and Sky News host Liz Storer. Jo, you wanted to say something. You were
obviously they've got this horribly wrong. Albo should have been at number 1.
Of course, he's not finished yet. So how can he be here?
This is the amazing thing. I mean, I think we can now officially just remove the word intelligence from artificial intelligence. I'll accept that it's artificial.
Well, is the system broken? I mean, this is a worry.
There's clearly something just terribly, terribly, terribly skewed about it. And the really interesting things is that it seems to rank these prime ministers based on what they espoused, not what they achieved. So it's like Malcolm Turnbull was, had really strong views on climate change. Yeah, right up until he got knifed in the back by his own party when he tried to enact them. Yeah. And again, Albo obviously is wonderful and is fantastic, but we don't know how we're going to get to, our targets by 2035 or 2030 or whatever it may be. So, again, it seems to be the complete triumph of virtue signalling over actual achievement. And if that is not the most sort of online thing you can possibly imagine. I mean, we all know that, spouting how pure and beautiful you are online is the new black these days.
Yeah.
AI seems to be picking up on that and now is reflecting it back onto reality. And that is frankly effing terrifying.
It is terrifying. Well, Liz, it labelled Kevin Rudd as one of Australia's most humane politicians for his apology to the stolen generation in 2008, yet Peter Dutton was the least humane for his role in implementing the Stop the Boats policy.
Meanwhile, Stop the Boats has saved that untold thousands of lives. Do me a favour, let's never go back to the dark days where we're seeing hundreds of people lose their lives. So clearly, though, this has been programmed. The fact that it's artificial intelligence means it only knows what it has been told. And because this is Meta's version of AI, we know we're dealing with the Zuckerberg team here. So naturally, it's going to be lefty leaning. And some of the explanations for the people who made the top 5, Julia Gillard made it because she was a woman. And you're like, but okay, how does that make her? Also, no regard to what clearly the people thought of the time, because you'd think that if you're going to list the most popular or the best prime ministers, you'd go with the ones who have had the longest term throughout the nation.
John Howard.
John Howard didn't get a mention. No. Menzies didn't even get a mention. Whitlam gets a mention, even though he's the one who's the only PM in our nation's history to get the boot from the GG.
What about John Curtin? He saved us from the Japanese in World War II. We're only here because of it. But this is exactly what I'm saying, though.
It was the Yanks that saved us.
AI is obviously scouring the internet for all this information. And clearly all the e-signatures of all politicians throughout history are now solely based on how much of a wank fest they are in terms of what they espouse and what people espouse about them.
Yes,
So imagine how many links the evil machine would have picked up about, say, Julia Gillard's misogyny speech.
Oh, of course.
Oh my God, this must be the most important political moment.
So put her in at number 3.
It's gone viral on YouTube.
Yeah.
And so, and again, that is how the algorithm will work.
Well, I mean, look, watch this space. We'll see who makes the cut if it comes out again next year. Now, in the space of just 1 week, 4 men have been charged, and New South Wales Police today released images of 12 men wanted due to their alleged violent and aggressive behaviour in the Wakely Church riots. Now, one of the men has already handed themselves over to police and his image has been taken down. Liz, I mean, look, obviously it is good news that we're seeing arrests, but it proves that if police wanted to, they could have easily tracked down those who participated in those disgusting anti-Semitic October 9 protests that we saw outside the Opera House.
Yeah, it's great when they flex because then we know, oh, you are capable of doing this.
Yes.
And there's instances in which you haven't lifted a finger to this day. But we already knew that, Danica, because obviously we have the names, the numbers, the everything else of the numerous hate preachers here in particularly Western Sydney. And again, there's been no retribution, no discipline whatsoever for the utterly hateful things that they have uttered. So yes, it's a very clear delineation there where they decide we will go to action in this case. Although I guess they would argue that the footage that we saw of the riot outside the church, there were people climbing on top of cop cars and kicking in windscreens. So I would encourage these guys just to hand themselves in. Some people have painted them as modern day martyrs because, why are Christians being, they're the ones being persecuted for rioting. No, it was pretty much a proper riot. We've seen the footage, and these guys, you don't get to smash into a cop car and expect for there to be...
It's an alleged riot.
Exactly. Whereas I guess even the police would argue that those guys never took on any of the police or the police property, as much as we object to what happened on the steps of the Opera House.
Yeah.
No violence was perpetrated toward the cops on scene.
Yes.
Whereas in this case, sadly, people weren't able to keep themselves under control.
Joe, do you think that there are similarities between or differences between the way police handled this alleged riot and what we saw outside of the Opera House?
Yeah, and this alleged riot, they had text messages. They were able to find out who the people were because they knew who was spreading around the messages that went viral that caused the riot. And there was clearly a riot there. What role these individuals played remains to be seen. And again, we saw even with the confusion over whether these ghastly protesters were chanting "Gas the Jews" or "Where's the Jews?"
Yes, that was a point
outside the Opera House. There just wasn't that electronic trace for the police to pursue. And again, it was at night. It was very, the footage was a bit grainy. There seemed to be a lot more, just by sheer weight of number. Thank God, there seemed to be a lot more footage of the stuff at Wakely, and of course the media was there very quickly. So I don't think so either. And I think the interesting thing with the hate preachers is if you actually look or listen to what they say, firstly, it's in Arabic, so it's very difficult. They're not saying this stuff publicly for sort of external Western consumption. They're sort of almost talking out two sides of their mouths. To the mosques, to the crowd at the mosque, they're whipping them up into a frenzy. We hate the Jews will all die and everything. But they rarely, shall we say, they will rarely say, all right, all of you now go out and kill Jews. They will say things like, please God, one day Allah will kill them all, or please one day all Jews will be dead.
Well, it's thinly veiled.
It's very thinly veiled, and it needs to be exposed.
Through that veil.
And it's clear. But this is what I'm saying though. It's clear what they are saying, but when it comes to actually trying to charge them with an offence, they can always say, well, we just said that one day Jews will die. We never said we were going to do it.
All right. Well, look, let's move on because two political hopefuls, Bronwyn Bock and Lucy Bradlow, are gunning for the same federal Melbourne seat of Higgins at the next election. No, they are not in competition. They've launched a joint run as independents, proposing to share the job, working a week on, a week off. They want to be FIFO, essentially, Liz.
I mean, what a way to warn people in advance. We're going to be pretty useless.
Yeah, basically.
The teal mentality is so strong here. This is embarrassing. I can't remember which one it is because my eyes glaze over when something this stupid comes up. But I did speed read this article, and one of them literally says, Parliament should be like any other job. Firstly, you can't do that in any other job. And secondly, no, this is an absolute honour. You're in the halls of power. If you're in the House of Reps, you are in 100, there's only 150 people who get to have that honour at any one time in any of the states as well. There's a very select group of people who get to have this honour. And you're just like, oh, it should be like any other workplace. No other workplace gets to make decisions on the daily that affect the rest of their nation or millions of people in their state. So even their rationale for it was just so pathetic.
It was a shocker.
You're like, rue the day these people would actually sit in the chamber.
I mean, if you can't make this a full-time job, why run at all, Joe?
Oh, it's amazing. I just can't wait for the little emails. He just says, NB, I'm only in the office Monday.
Out of office.
It is absolutely insane. Yes, other jobs do it. I know, the arts officers at Melbourne University Student Union from Left Focus managed to job share.
Well,
I mean, if they can, why not?
Anyone else can?
The number of questions this raises that appears that no one has actually thought of. Firstly, how are they going to transfer the vast amount of information that one has accumulated during parliamentary sitting week to the other one for the next parliamentary sitting week? Wouldn't that take another week?
And the salaries.
Here's what I learned this week. The salaries they can split, whatever. What happens? What about things like, if a parliamentarian goes bankrupt or is convicted of a crime that carries a jail sentence of a year or more, they are immediately disqualified from parliament. So what happens if one of them goes bankrupt? Does just one of them go and the other one stays? And then what happens to the electors who say, but no, I voted for the package, man.
That's it. Now, look, I want to get to this last one. This is interesting. A mother who was simply trying to breastfeed her baby was kicked out of a Melbourne comedy show after the comedian on stage said she and her baby were ruining his train of thought. The mother was obviously disappointed and even said she felt intimidated, while the comedian Arj Barker told the ABC that the show was strictly age 15 plus and that the baby was disrupting his performance. Was he right to kick her out, Liz?
Well, given he does point out this age restriction and the baby is under. Also, I am of the opinion there's a time and a place. I was very vocal about the first woman in Parliament breastfeeding in the chamber. Again, you don't get to do that in most jobs. And while a lot of mothers do this very discreetly in the odd cafe and what have you, which I have no problem with whatsoever, I wasn't there, so I can't speak to this particular situation, but some are particularly very out there about it, and it does make certain people incredibly uncomfortable.
We're almost out of time. Very quick from you, Joe.
I'm 1,000% on Arj Barker's side. My only bone of contention is a lack of procedural fairness because he never asked the baby for ID.
Oh, for goodness sake. All right, well, there you go. Ageism, precisely.
Okay, you're 15 years old. Let's see the passport. Let's see the license.
All right, Joe Hildebrand, Liz Liz, we'll see you later for the late debate. Thanks for joining us on the show. We'll stay with us coming up after the break. President Biden is closing the gap in the polls. So should Donald Trump be worried? I'll have the latest data next. Well, a New York court is preparing to hear opening statements for Donald Trump's hush money trial. He faces charges related to hush money payments made to adult film actress Stormy Daniels prior to the 2016 election. And despite the former president calling the trial a witch hunt, it could be affecting his popularity. A recent NBC poll revealing Biden gained 2 points over Trump from 42 to 44%, while Trump lost 1 point from 47 to 46. Joining me now is Sky News contributor Kosha Gada. Good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Can we trust this polling?
Great to be with you, Danica. So, I mean, the polling industry hasn't exactly covered itself in glory in recent elections globally, and not to mention a week is a lifetime in politics. We've got so many twists and turns left to go. So it's hard to say. I wouldn't read too much into it. However, I think the broader point that you're putting your finger on over here is very valid, which is that this lawfare, as it's been come to known right now, which is, using the legal system as a weapon of political warfare, which is what's happening here, is so unprecedented. It's never happened in the history of the Republic. And it's very difficult to really know how to measure that, for the polling industry to measure that, because we don't know ultimately how that's going to transpire, how it's going to manifest. It's galvanizing a lot of people who see it as very wrong and a misuse or abuse of the law and the application of the law. It's also turning a lot of other people off. And if he were to get convicted, which it looks like he will, in this particular trial before the election, is that label of being a convicted felon going to turn off enough people that will hurt him? And I think that's the big unknown that the next 6-7 months is going to reveal.
Absolutely, that is the key question. Now, in terms of that trial, what is expected for today's opening statements?
Like the whole essence of this case is that it's basically a bookkeeping error that in terms of he paid off this person who happens to be an adult porn star, and that obviously was going to make its way. There's a salacious nature of that in the opening statements. He didn't record it correctly in the books. Normally, that would be a misdemeanor that has a 2-year statute of limitations. However, Alvin Bragg, the district attorney over there in New York, has elevated it into 34 felony counts, and he's going to be sort of weaving that narrative and what the legal theory is, a novel legal theory, in that opening statement. The other side, Trump team's defense, is going to make the point, that I just made, that it's really a stretch, and it's never been a legal theory that's ever been applied before, and they're going to try and dismantle that. But I think the broader point is, in New York, the judge doesn't really like him. The jury is most likely not going to be a jury of his peers, because 87% of people in New York City voted for Biden. And so I think even these opening statements and everything else, it's sort of just window dressing, and it's almost like we sort of know which way this is going to go because of the way the jury pool and the judge is inclined to be.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. Now, meanwhile, Donald Trump is expected to soon announce his vice presidential pick. This is going to be interesting. Kosha, who are the favourites?
This is the other thing with Trump. He is notorious for being unpredictable, and it's anybody's guess. I would think of it in a few categories. So there are some of these moderate Republicans that have sort of come home to him or come in his direction, people like Nancy Mace, Elise Stefanik, J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, who are all sort of critical or even moderate to him years ago, but over the course of the past 3 to 4 years have really actually come out as strong supporters of him. That's one category. If he feels that he wants to shore up the moderates who maybe don't like him and have never liked him that much. The other category is the conservative firebrands, like Vivek Ramaswamy, who made a name for himself in the primary, Carrie Lake from Arizona. Tucker Carlson's name has been floated out there. The former Fox News host has a huge audience. People like that. That category would be if he really wants somebody who's in his image and can really carry the mantle and his policy prescriptions. Then there's some other wild cards like Tulsi Gabbard, who is a defected Democrat congresswoman from Hawaii who left and became an independent. That could be interesting in terms of cannibalizing some of the Democrat vote. And yet with Trump, there could be another wild card that's not even on the list that I just mentioned that would surprise anybody. You never know.
Well, anything is possible, as we know, with Donald Trump, so we'll wait and see. Now, the US House has approved the long-awaited $95 billion foreign aid package for Ukraine, which has been warmly welcomed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, after months of stalling. Now, Kosha, this has been a very contentious one. Many Western leaders have praised the decision, but many others have been critical of the amount of funding and lack of border provisions.
Very, very contentious. I think, the bottom line or the foundation here is that the support by the American people for the level of funding that has gone into this war and, in fact, other wars has been steadily declining, and especially among the Republican base. And, of course, the Republicans hold the House right now, albeit with a very slim majority. That support has really been declining. So it is actually very unpopular with the base. The reasons, there's a practical reason for it. If you're $34 trillion in debt, the interest payments alone to finance our debt with current interest rates is $1 trillion a year, and just cross that mark. It's just there isn't enough money. That's sort of one layer to it. The other layer, as you mentioned, is the lack of border provisions and other problems at home. It just doesn't play very well politically that all this money is going to secure other countries' borders when our own border is wide open. You've heard that rhetoric come out there, and it sticks. It's pretty sticky. And then I think just the principle of it, of how much involvement should the U.S. have. Right. So that's why this has been a contentious issue, but it's passed finally.
It certainly is. Kosha Gada, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Well, that's all we've got time for. Now it's time for Paul Murray Live.